Imagine this. A seasoned flight attendant, confident in her duties, refuses to serve an elderly black woman because she's too much trouble. But what she doesn't know is that this woman isn't just any passenger, she's the airline's secret CEO. What starts as a simple misunderstanding quickly spirals into a shocking twist that no one on that flight could have predicted. As the flight continues, tensions rise, and the flight attendant's attitude begins to backfire in the most unexpected way. But how will this encounter unfold? What happens when the airline's highest executive steps forward? Stay tuned to find out how one decision turns everything upside down, and how power, respect, and humility can change the course of a flight and a life. The elderly woman, Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, had been looking forward to her flight to visit family. She was no stranger to travel, but that morning something felt different. She sat quietly, adjusting her glasses as she settled into her seat, unaware of the tension building around her. The flight attendant, a young woman named Heather, was already feeling the pressure of a long, busy day. She had dealt with rude passengers, delays, and an unruly crew. When she approached Mrs. Johnson, her patience was wearing thin. The request for a simple cup of water was met with an abrupt refusal, and Heather's dismissive tone only made things worse. Mrs. Johnson, however, kept her calm. She'd have faced much worse in her long life. But little did Heather know, Mrs. Johnson was no ordinary traveler, and that simple act of defiance would soon expose a whole new world of consequences. As the flight continued, Heather couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The elderly woman had sat quietly, never making a fuss, but there was an air of dignity around her that Heather couldn't quite place. She noticed the other passengers whispering, some even stealing glances at Mrs. Johnson, as if they knew something Heather didn't. Heather brushed it off. After all, she had a job to do. But the more she thought about it, the more irritated she became. Who was this woman, acting as if she deserved special treatment? Was it just another case of an entitled passenger? Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson stared out the window, her mind racing. She had spent decades building her career, working her way up from nothing. She had seen the world change in ways most could never imagine. But this moment, this flight, was different. She wasn't here to play games. She was here to see if Heather's behavior could be corrected, and if the airline needed a lesson in respect. The tension simmered between them. Heather, annoyed by the silence, glanced at the flight manifest. She noticed Mrs. Johnson's name, but it didn't register until she did a double take. The name Evelyn Johnson was followed by a title, CEO. Her stomach dropped. Could this really be the same Evelyn Johnson, the elusive, powerful woman behind the airline's multi-billion-dollar empire? Heather's mind raced. She had heard rumors of a secret CEO, someone who stayed behind the scenes, avoiding public attention. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined meeting her in such an ordinary setting, in such a volatile situation. Heather's heart pounded as she realized the woman she had just dismissed might have the power to ruin her career with a single word. Still, Heather wasn't ready to admit her mistake. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that she needed to focus on her duties. But every second that passed, the weight of her actions became heavier. The air around her seemed to thicken, as if the whole plane was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Mrs. Johnson's eyes never left the window, her calm demeanor belying the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. The woman wasn't just trying to save face. She was trying to decide how to make Heather, and the entire crew, understand the consequences of their actions. And as the flight neared its final leg, it became clear that whatever Mrs. Johnson had planned, Heather wouldn't be able to escape the fallout. The final stretch of the flight felt like an eternity. Heather could barely concentrate, her thoughts racing in circles. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mistake had crossed a line she might never be able to undo. What if Mrs. Johnson really was the CEO? What if she complained about Heather's treatment and the whole crew would be in trouble? The pressure built up until Heather could hardly breathe. She tried to focus on the tasks ahead, refilling drinks and checking in on passengers, but her eyes kept darting back to the elderly woman in seat 23A. The once quiet, unassuming figure now felt like a ticking time bomb. Around the cabin, whispers spread like wildfire. A few passengers had caught on to the identity of the woman in question, and word traveled quickly. One by one, they began to exchange knowing glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson sat in silence, her face composed, betraying nothing of the storm brewing in her mind. But Heather could see the tension in her hands, clasped neatly on her lap. She wanted to apologize, to take back the harsh words and the unspoken judgment, but she didn't know how. What if Mrs. Johnson didn't want an apology? What if she wanted something more, something Heather couldn't give? As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but it barely registered to Heather. Her eyes were fixed on Mrs. Johnson, who slowly turned to face her. The tension was palpable, as though the entire cabin was holding its breath. "Excuse me," Mrs. Johnson's voice was soft, but it carried through the stillness. "I think it's time we had a word." Heather's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment she would either face the consequences of her actions or somehow find a way to salvage the situation. Her palms were sweating, and her mind felt foggy. What could she say? Before she could respond, Mrs. Johnson slowly rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and graceful, as if every step was calculated. The entire cabin seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Passengers stopped talking, eyes locked on the two women, all wondering what would happen next. Heather's breath hitched as Mrs. Johnson approached her, her presence now larger than life. With a calm, unwavering, the man ignored her, his gaze fixed solely on Mrs. Johnson. "It's too late for that. They've already found out," he said, his tone low, but filled with an undeniable sense of urgency. Mrs. Johnson's expression flickered, but only for a moment. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she met the man's gaze with a steady, almost predatory calm. "You think this is going to stop me?" she said, her voice carrying an edge of authority that sent a chill down Heather's spine. The man, now fully standing, leaned forward slightly. "I'm afraid it's already too late. The board knows everything. They've already moved on to Plan B." His eyes darted around the cabin, as if checking for anyone else who might be listening. "You're walking into a trap." For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the cabin, broken only by the faint hum of the airplane's engines. Heather felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. What was happening? How had everything shifted so suddenly from a simple confrontation to something far more dangerous? Mrs. Johnson's gaze hardened, and without missing a beat, she replied, "You've underestimated me before, and you'll do it again." The man's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, allowing her to continue on her. Before she could respond, the galley door opened again, and Mrs. Johnson emerged. The look on her face was no longer one of calm authority. It was a mask of cold, calculated precision. "Heather," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet anger. "You've done something unforgivable, but it's not too late to make things right." The tension in the cabin was suffocating now, everyone holding their breath as Mrs. Johnson walked toward Heather, the footsteps echoing like a countdown. Heather swallowed hard, but before she could speak, the man in the suit stepped forward again. "Enough," he said sharply, cutting her off. "This ends now." For a split second, Heather thought she saw something in his eyes, a flash of recognition, something personal. Then the pilot stood, and all hell broke loose. The man in the suit moved quickly, grabbing one of the flight attendants by the arm. In a blur of motion, chaos erupted in the cabin. The other passengers screamed, some ducking under their seats, while others tried to call for help. But it was clear this was no ordinary disruption. It was an orchestrated takeover. Mrs. Johnson turned toward Heather, her eyes narrowing with finality. "You think this was just about a mistake? A moment of disrespect?" She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "This was never about you. It was always about power." control, and now you're part of the plan." Heather's head spun, unable to process what Mrs. Johnson was saying. A plan? What plan? As the man in the suit grabbed a hidden device from